Welcome to our show, Leap to Scale. The podcast here is sponsored by Algo AI. We help fintech service companies and business scale using smarter AI solutions. If you want to book a free call, click the link in the description below. Today's guest, we've got Chris. Chris, I really appreciate you making time for this. Thank you so much. Chris here is a managing partner at ATOMIQ, or ATOMIQ, an alternative asset and AI-powered venture studio, co-creator of the Web3 show, best-selling co-author, and I think he's got a new book in the way. But actually, I kind of do a good job to describe and introduce Chris. So Chris, I'm going to let you introduce a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get started.
Awesome. Yeah, well, it's great to be here. And Chris Snook is the name. I am an author, and I also write a newsletter called wealthmatterstome.com on Substack, and I run a venture studio and virtual family office called ATOMIQ, spelled with an IQ at the end, not an IC. And we basically build explosive business units on top of emerging technology with proven entrepreneurs. We either acquire them or we merge and partner with them. And we're heavily focused on the areas of advisory that would relate to legal or insurance, finance, or tax, and that would fall into the category of small business, meaning their revenues are between 2.5 to 10 million annually as a sweet spot. 5 to 50 is kind of a expanded sweet spot. And we have them both as clients of some of our technologies or as partners as we look for acquisitive ways to grow. So that's me. And
I appreciate it. And this for the audience. I'm sure you've seen Chris on other mediums, be it books, websites, or other podcasts. And I'm sure this is just a very, very small tip of the iceberg. This man's a very accomplished individual. Encourage you to go check out the different different resources there. So, Chris, question for you: how did you first get into this fintech, Web3 alt asset space?
Well, years ago, we're going back 12, 15 years. Well, let's go back to 2009. So my career as a quote unquote entrepreneur, and I put quote unquote because when I started, it wasn't something that you aspired to be. It wasn't something you put on your handle. It just meant you couldn't get a job. Or you were not willing to work for somebody for whatever, they were willing to pay. And so you kind of went out on your own. And no one could explain to you what you did, and you couldn't explain to them, right? Like, what does he do? Well, I don't know. He does a bunch of different things, right? Like that kind of entrepreneur. So fast forward the first 10 years, I kicked around and learned a lot of lessons. I didn't come from a business background growing up. I didn't really have any examples, so I kind of had to learn by doing. And I got a lot of different mentors along the way, all of which I'm grateful for, many of which I wouldn't have repeated or chosen in hindsight. I mean, not again, but I'm grateful for all of them because I didn't know what I didn't know. And, those who have seen other versions of this, I won't bore you with, but my first kind of experience was I'm going to lose $500,000 of my own money and some friends, family, and fools over 4 years because I don't know how to do it shorter than that. And then I'm going to spend the next 2.5 to 3 years earning it all back to get to zero. And then I actually might get started. And so that was the first 7 years. So by 2009, I had gone through that. I'd come back from it. I'd had another success. I had another failure. And then I'd come out of that. And I decided that I was going to go into technology. I didn't know anything about technology before that, really. But I decided that very intently, and it was on the heels of the financial crisis and everything else. And I did that because I pragmatically, and you'll hear pragmatics a lot, I just saw what I saw was inevitable. Like software, as Andreessen said, is going to eat the world. If I'm going to learn how to make money, I've learned how to make money in all kinds of industries so far that I never thought I would be in, because in those prior years, I'd done everything from wholesale finance to small market LBO analysis to flipping real estate to, and I was like, none of that stuff was on my bingo card when I was coming out of high school playing football and going to college, right? Like as an exercise physiology major. So if I can learn all that, I'm going to go where the money's going, and the money is going into tech. And so I'm going to apply this mouth and this energy and this knowledge to get really curious on what that means and how I could position in front of it. So that was 2009. And then I kind of missed, because of that, social, to, like the early days of social, because again, if you recall, that was starting around 0405, and like the wave had come. We were in a place now where Facebook had kind of won, Google had won, YouTube was winning, Twitter was just getting started, but looked interesting. And so invested in two companies. One was a publishing company, because I had authored a book early on in 05, 06 with my wife. And then I wrote a second one in 07 called Wealth Matters, which will be kind of the theme of today and the rest of my career. But that first edition of Wealth Matters, which was my second book, came out through a vanity publisher in 07. I wrote it in 06, but it came out in 07. And so as everything was getting disrupted by technology, we'd had Napster, it was 10 years old, like we had all these things that were demonetizing and dematerializing other industries, but we hadn't figured out the example of like what to do next. The business models weren't clear yet. And as that happened, I just made the decision that content was going to be king. And then, so I invested a little bit of money that I had saved up from doing some consulting into a publishing company. And we did 45 books in 18 months with CEOs and like kind of mid-tier business book authors, because that's what I understood and that's what I was passionate about and that's what we could sell. And then in parallel to that, I had invested in a company and started a company called Parallel 6, which was started out as social media managed services, but it was always built to be a technology company. We just paid the bills, and we were in San Diego, so you couldn't really raise a lot of venture at that time. So we had to figure out how to do it with cheap. So we seeded it, 5 of us seeded it. We got it into revenue using social media managed services, and then we started to put technology behind it. We built a mobile enterprise analytics platform back in late 2009, early 2010. And we were selling it to everybody from, the racetracks to the Marriott's of the world and whatever. And that was when I first kind of got a sense of the future and had that weird feeling of like, holy cow, this is rad. Ooh, this is creepy, like all at the same time. And so we ended up selling that company in 2017, but I stepped off the board and kind of out of any day-to-day in 2013. I shut the publishing company down in 2012 because the partner that I had invested in, did the things that some people do, just decided he wanted to quit and didn't want to work with me anymore. And there was no real, I didn't want to operate it day-to-day. He was kind of the sales funnel. I was the back end and the editor-in-chief and like the whole operation, but I didn't want to, it just didn't make sense for me to do it all. So we shut that down. I gave everybody their rights back, called it a success after 2 years, and didn't know what to do. And so that was when I went into Qualcomm on a consulting gig short term through a friend of mine. And I kind of got exposed to a 20,000 person company, which I'd never been inside of before. That lasted 3.5 months because I was too good at my job. They hired me for 5. I did it in 3.5. They gave me a qual star and let me go. So I gave up 2 months of checks that I could. But again, another lesson learned. And then we moved to Colorado. And so that was when I went really deep into the community side of things. And now it's 2013 to 2015. And I didn't have any hobbies. I don't really have any hobbies. I wasn't doing anything. I didn't have an income. We had enough money to hang ourselves if we, didn't bring any money in. So we lived really lean and had a young child at the time. He was like just under 2. And didn't know anybody. And so I just started mentoring. I was already doing like Founder Institute, but I started mentoring at Techstars and Boomtown Accelerator, which was an ad tech accelerator in Boulder. And anybody's ever been to Colorado, they have this thing called Give First, but it's actually something they really believe. And so the environment was just amazing from a startup standpoint. So I got like really steeped into that. And then I was just looking for a gig to do next. I was looking for something I could join that was going to basically be worth the opportunity cost. And I was being patient this time because instead of starting something, I was like, well, look, I'm in Boulder. There's all this venture money. I'm in Fort Collins. Like, this is a great ecosystem. Let me find something that I don't have to build myself and where I could come in and amplify it and get a nice exit while I'm waiting for this other exit with Parallel 6. And I did that for 2 years, got tired of winter, and decided that Web 2 was over. And so, in 2014, when you realize Web 2 is over, but Web 3 isn't here yet, like, what do you do? And I didn't know. So what you do is you just start studying and getting really curious about things you've been hearing about and curious about from 2012-ish on, like Bitcoin and whatever, and you kind of go, when is this going to happen? And it's early. And so I just kind of figured out how to make ends meet and, kind of spend my time doing that work, like really trying to understand this world of Web3, and to your point, then adjacently FinTech and anything like it, and what that convergence might look like. And so I ran out of patience of not making a check in 2015. I ran out of patience for winter in 2015. And when I say I mean my wife and me. You don't have enough money. Figure it out. And so we went down to Costa Rica, and and then I got drawn into Arizona for a turnaround with a digital agency, and wrote a book called Digital Sense during that time because I needed to figure out a way to communicate around customer experience to CMOs and C-level and help this agency turn around. So that kind of brought in a whole new exposure point around customer experience and digital transformation, and added to my other stack of knowledge. And then we successfully, turned that company around in 12 months from a $1.2 million loss to a $642,000 EBITDA gain, on less revenue with less employees. And then we got it bought by the investor group, recapitalized. We got it merged in with another company. And I was the most expensive guy there next to the CFO, and I knew I was going to be gone. Like, that was kind of, I always knew that. I knew it was going to be forever. But now we were firmly planted there, and I had kind of written the book. And so I was like, okay, cool. Now we can start the venture studio again and do that. And so that was 2017. And then Parallel 6 sold to PRA Health Sciences. So we got a little exit in that May. And then it was like, okay, well, let's do this venture studio thing, which evolved into ATOMIQ. But it started out as a launch house in Colorado. And so we just kind of bridged off of that, but now funded it with some money. And then, yeah, the rest is, here we are.
That's amazing. It sounds like you've had a very interesting journey between entrepreneur operator and paralleling that with as an investor or a strategist, and sometimes intertwining, sometimes you lean on one side or the other. And that's quite the fascinating sort of journey that you've gone through. I'm curious, what's kept you motivated along the way? Because naturally, with a win, I can appreciate where the motivation comes from, but the way you describe those losses or those dips that come through, what kept you going day to day? And also, not to mention, you're a very diverse individual. You've got your books, you got the thesis with Atomic IQ, and then you've got the community aspect. How do you keep yourself going?
That's the question that really matters. I mean, the reality is that there was so many things in there that I either over controlled and shouldn't have, but I didn't know that at the time, or that I kind of completely let go of, but that I then didn't have I didn't take the time to kind of think and go, how does this map to the 25-year-old version of Chris that set out to basically be economically independent? And then what would happen is I'd have a win or I'd have a loss, and then I'd be reminded of what I had forgotten to stay in tune with. And I say all that because, there are no mistakes in the sense of things that aren't, like, there's mistakes, but there are no accidents. Yet, when you are curious and when you're, call it, talented and ambitious and aggressive, all of which, I'm blessed to be, cursed to be, whatever. Um, you can end up doing things you never anticipated doing, which is cool. You could also end up really distracted and doing things that you don't really enjoy. And I say that because you find out the latter when you realize that every year seems to get shorter. And anyone who's had kids knows this, right? Like, you go, oh my gosh, like, my 2-year-old from Colorado is turning 14 in a couple weeks. Like, but then it'll be like, oh my gosh, he's driving. Then it'll be like, oh my gosh, he's got a, like, significant other, and they're talking about getting married. And then it's like, what the hell? Like, And oh, my twins that are 21 is like months, it's like, wow, they're 21 months. Wait, that's almost 2 years. Wait, we had those babies 2 years ago, which means we went to Prague 3 years ago, which means, and you're going, wait, that was 3 years ago. Like, what am I doing with myself? And I say that because that's what I'm in. Right. So, the, the, the real answer is what keeps you going is, I don't know if that's the question I've asked myself, but it's kind of like, you, you're breathing, right? So you keep going because you still exist. Are you going in the direction that you want? Are you going at the pace that you could be? Are you dragging along people, places, things, and habits just because? Um, or out of some false sense of loyalty, or out of some sense of something that doesn't actually matter, but that we tell ourselves does, like, I need to prove this, or I need to be loyal, or I need to make good on that, or I need to, and the other person may or may not feel the same way or reciprocate, but you don't even consider that. And so I think as I've moved forward, I'm trying, and it's hard to do with a curious brain. I'm trying to do less and less and less, and to be more at that less. And that is a challenge that keeps me going, because we live at a time where more is inevitable. So you're trying to be,
Yeah.
as my friend and mentor Mickey McManus says, you're trying to focus on better, right? You're trying to act, because more is inevitable, less is a constraint, meaning like we can only do so much. And the older we get and the more that comes at us, the less we can even pay attention to, whether it's a podcast, whatever, right? We have less
Right.
capacity because there's more, exponentially more at us. And so we have less capacity to give it our attention. We have more screens. We have less attention to each one. We have more beeps and buzzes and distractions. So we give less attention to each one. And what we're trying to do is be better at whatever we are doing, but inside of this constant, paradigm of more and less. And
Yeah.
that's keeps me going, is to be better at whatever it is I'm actually doing in that moment or in that cycle, because that's the one thing that you can do. You can be better. I can be better at the thing I'm doing. And so that's what keeps me going now. Now, the other thing that's going is a lot of prayer, especially, hate to admit it, but I pray more when it's hard. I think that's pretty normal. Um, Trying to be better at praying when it's good.
And I appreciate you being very candid and very vulnerable there. I hadn't thought of it in that way, that as we go through, more's thrown at us, and therefore we've got less to give, not because of an absolute amount, but because of the relative of where we're going to pick and choose the attention that comes through. And that prayer piece right at the end, I'm touched that you share that. I appreciate that, because I think I too relate to that, and I think prayer at the end of the day, it's however the viewers may think of it, it's a way of reconnecting with one's inner self. And on the spirit or on that topic of inner self, you made an interesting comment there about how would the 25-year-old version of Chris think about this. And so, small, curiosity for me to ask you is, how often do you ask yourself that question, especially with as life has gone on the way you've described it? You first had your first child at 2, and now you got twins, and you're moving back from Costa Rica back to Arizona, and now you've got Atomic IQ come to life, and things have compounded and compounded, and naturally the focus is to get better. How do you, or how often do you sort of check in with yourself when it comes to something like that?
Um, I don't look backwards very often. That's meaning, like, I never have lamented the past. I'm a fan of history, and I'm more curious about history now than ever, because I have learned, right or wrong, I've learned that humans um don't really, like, we invent new ways to do the same crap that we've always done. And we call it new, but at the end of the day, like, behavior is behavior, and we don't evolve in picoseconds like our technology does. We evolve over millions of years. So since we've only got, whatever you want to call it, 10, 20,000 years worth of recorded history that we know of, like, we can pretty much look back 10,000 years and know what we're going to do for the next 100 as behaviorists, as humans. What we won't necessarily know is what we're going to invent, right? Like what we're going to see in the economy or in technology in the next 24 months, none of us can predict. And that's the interesting complexity, right? Is that we manufacture complexity and innovation now in picoseconds. And Rebecca Costa is a old friend of mine and great author, says it the best, where she says complexity is the reality of having more wrong choices than right ones. So whenever you want to understand what is complexity, how does that show up? It just means that you have more wrong choices in a scenario than you have right ones. That's when you know you're in a complex environment. So when you're in a simple environment, you have more right choices, wrong ones, and they're obvious. So when you think about that and you go, do you look backwards or what do you look at? I don't go, what would 25-year-old Chris think? I go, can I simplify this? And if I could simplify it, because sometimes I can't, right? If I could simplify it, am I clear on what decision I would make? If I can simplify it and I can get clear on what decision I would make by removing all the complexity, some of which I cannot control, most of which I can't control, am I doing that? In other words, or am I trying to make a decision in the complexity? And then it's a matter of, well, wait, so if you could remove it arbitrarily, like if you could remove all that complexity and arrive at a different answer when faced with simplicity than what you're doing right now, then it's like, okay, so why am I letting the complexity exist? And then you can go down the thread of, am I letting it exist, or am I just tolerating it and letting someone else make it exist in my reality? And then you can ask, am I letting someone else shape my reality, or am I shaping my reality? And then you get to a place where you can have a productive conversation with yourself.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the way you've described it, like what really stood out for me is this exercise of simplification. But simplification, I think, requires a couple of, I think, core pieces to exist. One, it's awareness of alignment of what is your purpose, right? Because I think that's where the right and wrong answers, or the signal and noise ratios, as some call it, that starts to really stand out. And then the other aspect then is taking the diligent, reflective lens to it and be like, okay, hold on, this is complicated. I got to just check in with myself for a second and sort of go through that exercise. And naturally, the way you describe it, right? I think it's often overlooked, especially when you look at the younger entrepreneurs who are looking to grow and scale quick and fast, that you've got experience under your belt. And all of that experience, I would wager, has contributed to your ability to simplify these or to highlight the signal versus the noise as it comes through. And I think the way you describe is very fascinating in terms of as a way of self-checking, right? To make sure that you are living your truth, so to speak, in alignment with your purpose.
One of the things it makes me think of is back to the spiritual conversation. And again, there's a difference between spiritual and religious, right? Religious is a tradition, practice, and a set of ideologies around how you organize to your spiritual nature. And we can debate those different things and we can respect those different things, and everyone's entitled to both. If you believe that we are physical beings having a spiritual experience, that's different than if you think we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. And anyone who's ever had the pain or the pleasure, or both, of being next to someone when they pass away, and I say it's both because usually it's painful in any number of ways, the pleasure of it is at least being there and recognizing that you were able to be there. When you watch that happen, right? Whenever you watch that happen, there is a moment where the spirit of that individual leaves the body. And regardless of where you think that goes, if you've ever seen it, you know what I'm talking about. There's the final exhale of breath. And there is this thing that leaves the body, this energy that leaves the body, and the body therefore rots. It lies, and that's it. And then it decays from there, right? And so if you've ever experienced that at any level, regardless of where you think that spirit does or doesn't go, it becomes apparent that it continues to exist in an energetic form. And so when you want to simplify all that, you go, okay, well then first law of thermodynamics says, I think it's the first law, says that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It merely changes form. And so it's never created nor destroyed. It merely changes form. Now, consciousness is a form of that energy. So consciousness may leave and may change. In other words, we don't again, you're not getting into the weeds on that yet. The point I'm trying to make is if you simplify it down to the core essence, we are energy. And as energy, we, as the spiritual aspect of us, enter into some physical representation, this avatar we call us, this body, this bald head and this beard and, white skin and yours beard and whatever. And that's where we kind of hang out and we do things. But at the end of the day, like that spiritual aspect came from somewhere and returned to somewhere, and it's never destroyed. And so Wallace Wattles wrote a book called The Science of Getting Rich. There's books like the Upanishads. There's books like the Bible. There's books like the Quran. There's books, all kinds of books trying to organize what happens and what does this mean and who does it belong to and what is the way. Tao Te Ching, Buddhism. And so the center of town is that we are energetic spiritual beings. You can approach that however you want, but you can't change the center of town. So then if you want to simplify and go, well, how do I get success? Whatever you define as success. By purpose. Well, your purpose is whatever you say it is. There's, your purpose is whatever you decide to direct your energy to. And your energy impresses upon what Wallace Wattles calls formless substance, the universe. It impresses on formless substance and it makes an imprint. And it makes other things move in regards to it. It attracts other energies to it. It repels other energies from it. And it makes an impact, deep or not, in the energy in the direction it is applied. And so part of it's just getting to the place where you give yourself permission to pick what you want your purpose to be. So, as I've gotten older, I just think about that more. I think about it nowadays versus, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I spend more time in conversation with spirit, with God, with however you want to relate to it. I call him God. And I say, how do you want me to be used? Because I just want to be useful.
Yeah.
I just want to be. That's one thing I'm clear on. What I'm not clear on is how I'll be being used from now or 5 years from now. And I less attachment to that, meaning the sense of I used to care a lot about that in my early 20s. I really cared about picking that. I care less about picking that, and I care about the main thing, which is, am I being useful? Because I've been given so much. I've been given so much talent, so much, the ability to compute so many things so fast, the ability to build relationships. I've been given a lot of weaknesses and vulnerabilities too, but I've been given so many strengths. I'm like, I just want to be useful. So how do you want me to use these things that you've given me? Because I've got my ideas, but my ideas might suck, and sometimes they really suck. And sometimes I end up more miserable than I thought I would be, even when I get the success that I wanted in that area. So I'm just trying to tap more into that energetic level and try and listen. And then, what became clearer recently and, some meditation, some whatever is what I just said to you, which is purpose is whatever you choose. Like it can work with whatever. If you're aligned with it, it'll work with you, whatever you want to. Are you doing it with me and for me? Or are you as a representation of the gifts that I'm giving you? Or are you fighting me and doing it for you? And you meaning like the non-awake version, right? And so just kind of like recognizing the evolution of what's interesting today for you and your spirit versus what was interesting 5-6 seconds ago. And if that can change, then you can change. And that's usually where we get fulfillment is it's the journey, not the destination. We can recognize the accomplishments and we can recognize the adversity and we can derive joy from both. But at the end of the day, the meaning comes from staying in the game and getting another at bat.
I was going to say a lot of what you said resonates quite a bit. And I mean, you're a believer, so am I. And I think the thing that sort of was surfaced back for me in this conversation is the recognition that we can either have our energies match our carnal desires or our higher purpose. And that selection between that and the process of what it takes to get that sort of awareness, I think, is a function of life. And the way you've described it, I would even position as that's the beauty of being a human. It's the human condition to sort of ebb and flow with these between these levels, however you recognize and relate to spirit, spirituality and religion. And I think that's kind of profound. And I think to be able to sit back and look back and see the experiences that you've had, and then to use that to be able to guide where you're going to go forward, but from the lens of, hey, am I fulfilling the purpose? And I think purpose here defined as, am I being useful? Or however, one defines that. I think that adds a lot of energy. And I think it goes back to the earlier question I was asking about motivation. It becomes automatic, right? Because there's natural alignment in that. I think we sidetracked quite a bit, but I think this was important to be talked about. Just it came up in this conversation, and in the spirit of how we were talking about it, I think it was meant to come up, right? And so I appreciate you taking that tangent, and I think it's riveting, and I am sure the folks listening on, I think, will find this very useful. Pivot gears a little bit. You've been vocal about blending the human trust and the AI systems to be able to create measurable growth or client retention. I think the way you coined it was the human AI handshake. And so if we were to sort of backtrack a little bit, to I think a few minutes back, we're talking about changes happening in the picoseconds today versus for humans. If we look into the technology and how you pivot into financial services, I'd like to get a little more tactical on how financial service leaders can grow their client base. You're operating at the intersection of virtual family office, venture studio, community is a core tenet of this. And you've diversified in terms of the different medias, platforms you're engaged with. The question for you is, what's the growth engine that's performing best right now? And curious to understand why you think one over the other.
Well, where I'm investing time, energy, and effort is a re-engagement with the personal brand and the platforms that I can communicate through that. For reasons we don't need to get into now because they were totally different. Several years ago, I kind of went the opposite direction where I went binary with it. I shut down the kind of personal social for a variety of reasons as I learned how they worked and wasn't interested in, the trade. But then I left a lot of money and a lot of opportunity on the table related to, the thought leadership, the reach and whatever. And I realize now it didn't have to be a binary decision. I don't regret the decision, but I'm focused now on, well, where are the platforms that, have one and where they have the audiences that I care about. And then what is my presence there? So I've started with Substack as kind of a major focus because it's having another moment. It had one years ago, but it's kind of having a second moment now that's more significant. And I think, the tough thing about being a financial advisor specifically, and even like an insurance advisor or an RIA or, the people that we serve and deal with, because of the regulatory environment, there's a lot of things they cannot do. Right. So it's kind of like, how do you promote yourself as a personal brand when your compliance department won't let you do anything? Right. And you can't do what you do without that series, whatever license. Right. And so it's an interesting challenge. And, the other challenge that financial advisors have specifically is that they live in a world that's pretty much commoditized. Because, having talked to a lot of, and also talking to the clients, like I said, call it that $3 to $10, $20 million client, which there's not an advisor on this phone that wouldn't pick up a $3 to $20 million investment, like investable client tomorrow. Like all of us, sure, come on in. Right. But at the end of the day, like, that client doesn't really call you that much. And at least for the last 15 to 20 years, because for the last 15, 20 years, as long as they didn't do anything stupid, they just made money. So we like to act like we're really smart, but at the end of the day, when we're printing money at the clip that we've printed it in the last 10 years, and we've had 0% interest rate for the bulk of it up until 2 or 3 years ago, like, no offense, but you don't have to be that great. Right? And so a lot of the investors, meaning the actual clients, are passive and have been and will stay that way, but they're richer And so who gets credit for that? Well, whoever they've had their money with, because he didn't lose their money or she didn't lose their money. But that doesn't mean that they will feel that way in a market that's not that way. And yet, if you're the advisor, you're kind of not really excited about like calling them too much, because you don't want to remind them that you still have your money if they're kind of passive and just leaving it there, because they might start to like question, like, why isn't he calling me more? So the ROI on like touching base with them, and I'm not saying guys would admit this, but I've talked with enough to know that this is a variable for some. There's kind of a risk reward ratio of how much human touch I do. Then there's the risk reward ratio of a lot of what I do is I subscribe to my custodian, whoever that is. I'm not going to pick like whether it's Altruist or Schwab or whoever your custodian is, and they have a series of models, and I can base that model, and then I can put it to work for you, and you have your 60/40 portfolio, or you have your whatever customizations I'm doing. And the person that gave me their money just doesn't want me to lose it, like my aunt and uncle, right? They like, well, why'd you pick the guy? Well, because we liked him. That was literally a comment. And he got referred by someone else that helped us sell our business that we liked and trusted. And so we just said, great. There's no reason to shop around. And then it was like, okay, well, so do you feel like you get good updates from good advice? Like, would you like to see more? Oh, no, he's done well. I mean, my statements come every quarter, and we got more money than we started with, and so no, I don't have any complaints right now. And what it made me realize is, again, complexity is simple. Like, don't over complexify the sale and the retention, Chris. Like, you're trying to think of all the different things that you would ask your advisor before you decided to keep them. But the reality is people that have significant amount of capital are not necessarily asking these questions. So you're over complexifying the relationship you're trying to scale for these advisors, because maybe 3% of the people out there that have that kind of money, $500K to 20 million, are going to ask those questions, but 97% of them are not going to interview more than one person, and they're going to take a warm referral, and they don't read blogs all the weekend wondering if, macro and micro and crypto and this thing and AI is going to disrupt the like, they're not that interested. The only time they get interested is when they look at statement and it's down 30%, and now they're interested. But they're not interested like curious, they're panicked. And so really, it's like you have the advisor not wanting to shake something that's not broken, which I understand, wanting to figure out how to get more of it. Okay, warm market, referrals, lunch and learns, sure, all those things help, right? Just keep building. Be a good fiduciary. But then you have the compliance and all the regulatory things they got to keep up with that keep them away from being maybe more human. And so, but they don't have enough budget to invest in tech. And so what's going to happen, like if you take RIAs, for example, you had a huge amount of roll-ups in 22 and 23 by private equity for books that were between, call it $1 billion and $2 billion. And they're paying 22 times EBITDA, 18 to 22 times EBITDA, which is a really healthy number. They're paying 2 to 3 times revenue. So, on $1 billion in AUM, you might be earning 3.3 to $5 million in revenue at a 25% EBITDA. That's kind of standard. And so you're a small business. When you think about that, 3.5 to 5 million, like that's not a massive business, but it's a very nice lifestyle, right? You're paying yourself a salary, and then you're taking home 1.2 after it clears. Like you're doing nice on the golf course. And so, but the problem is you don't have a ton of budget. So like, AI, all this stuff comes up. You're like, oh my God, what are you going to do? It's like, they don't have the budget to do anything. Right. And the client doesn't care. Client's not going, hey, are you going to use AI to make sure that you manage my money better? Like the client's just assuming that you're not going to do anything stupid, and that you're going to keep getting them whatever you're getting them in the return. And as long as S&P keeps outperforming the cost of capital, then everybody is fine. Now, so I say all that because, again, how do you get more clients? Well, same way you've always gotten more clients, right, is try. Because the compound annual growth of financial services, if you just look at RIAs, just RIAs, I'm not talking about insurance, I'm not talking about anything else. If you just look at registered investment advisors and that market, there's roughly 16,000 of them in the United States, individuals. Out of the 16,000 of them, there is roughly 130 trillion, slightly south of that, like 129.7 or something, but just round it up. There's $130 trillion of assets under management, growing at 10.2% compound annual growth for the next 8 years. So that means every year that 130 is going to be 143. 143 is going to be 157. That 157 is going to be, right, like in trillions. And the amount of RIAs that are licensed is 16,000. But this is the most important thing. Out of the 16,000, 93% of that 130 trillion is managed by people with under $1 billion in AUM. So ballpark numbers, 15,000 of the 16,000 have books south of 1 billion AUM. That's not a fragmented market. That's like shattered glass, splintered glass, like, right? And so when you look at the private equity activity of 2023, what you saw was people buying up $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion books at a time because it was actually accretive to whatever. So like if you search your local market on Perplexity or something like that, and you say, show me the top 10 registered investment advisor in my zip code or in my county by AUM, most people, if they don't live in New York or Manhattan, right? I'm talking about like if you live in a small county, like Santa Barbara County, or you look somewhere like that, most people's number one is going to be some big shop. It's going to be JP Morgan Chase. It's going to be Edward Jones. It's going to be something like that. And it's going to be like 60 some odd billion or 100 billion AUM. The number two is going to be someone slightly south of that. And they're going to have double digit, like maybe 30, 50, whatever. It's going to be smaller, but it's going to be massive, right? And then number three is going to be like 1 to 2, 3 billion. And then number 4 to 7 is going to be between 180 million AUM and like 700 million AUM. So what's my point? So my point is that the majority of RIAs are managing a $400,000 to $1.5 million a year net business. And they went independent because they wanted to be independent and they wanted to be a fiduciary. And they serve clients and they love what they do. And they're kind of bulletproof in the sense of the industry is going to grow over the next 8 years, regardless of it, because we got to keep printing money. So if nothing else, assets are just going to appreciate because we're debasing currency that they're priced in. So that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is it doesn't really matter. AUMs are going to grow and the fragmentation is going to grow. And so how do you market? Well, it depends on who you are. What I am telling and what we're focused on is how can you bring a better human experience to that dynamic? Because we all know that technology can do things when it comes to like deterministic stuff, like stocks and bonds or whatever, technology can do better than humans all day long. But the problem is that since these guys like Jim Simons in the 80s invented AI that outperformed everybody, right? He's like a 39% IRR after fees for 40 years, right? Double what Buffett has, double what Dalio ever had. He never did it after 90 something. He never did it, I think, for outside money. And so he's not talked about a lot. But in the 80s, he invented some kind of algorithm and AI stuff back in the late 80s that outperformed the market. So the point is, you don't have that tool. I don't have that tool. You're not going to sell and win on technology. But where you can win is the fact my grandparents, my parents, me, you, my aunt and uncle, like when you think of everybody who has anything to invest, they don't care about that. They assume that, but where they want someone and where they want them more than ever, the human side of this handshake is someone dies. Someone's giving them an inheritance. Someone is going to college. Someone's getting ready to get married and have a baby, and they want to figure out how they can gift it without tax, right? When they do that, they want to sit across from someone they know, like, and trust and have that conversation. And if it takes an hour, they don't want to feel like they're on the clock. And so to me, it's back to the basics, which is human to human is going to win, whether it's restaurants and checkouts. Like none of us want to be checked out at a kiosk anymore. I don't care who you are. No one wants to tip for a grab and go sandwich. Like, there are certain things we've done in innovation at scale that just make no sense when you think about them as a human. Because everybody I talk to goes, "Yeah, I hate that when I get that tip thing, and it's just a stupid, like, n am I supposed to tip? I'm now feel bad because I didn't tip the guy for freaking just standing there while I checked out with my Apple Pay." And when we go to a restaurant, like, we know good service from bad service, and now it's like, well, I tip anyway because the person is at least coming here, taking my order, coming back and forth. Like, unless you really, really suck, I'm gonna tip you 20, 15, 20% just because. But, like, when I get great service, I really appreciate it, and I wanna go back to that restaurant. When I get great food, I really appreciate it and wanna go back to that restaurant. When I go somewhere and everybody's charging $20 for a burger because now they can with inflation, or they're charging $7 for a coffee because Starbucks set the bar, well, I'm not interested anymore. Like, now that's a premium that I have to justify. So, I'm huge at a micro level on small business stickiness, maybe even growth. Not at the scale of, like, what we think about when we look at Wall Street, where multiples are just based on needing somewhere to park endless amounts of dry powder that got created during the money era, right? Like, I'm talking about fundamental real business. Like, growing a small business 20, 30, 40% a year, dominating a local or a regional market, I think is probably the best time in the world right now. And when you think about that, that means a lot of small business owners that were at the 500 to $1 million clip are going to be looking out at retirements in the next 5 to 10 years where they're $5 to $10 million clip. And guess what? That $5 to $10 million net investable asset human doesn't have an RIA, doesn't have a legal advisor, doesn't have a financial team. So that's why I'm huge on virtual family office and using technology to build the infrastructure that normally a $250 million family would have and hire for, and democratize it for everyone. Because now with AI, you can do that. And so now you can create $1 billion infrastructure from a practical standpoint for the advisors managing $500K to $20 million humans. And if you can do that, then you can make it cost effective for the advisor or free to deploy, and you can make it cost effective for the end user. And there's 30 million people, or there's 30 million US in that category, between 500,000 and 20.
And so it sounds like you've figured out the ideal, dare I say, ideal client profile, right? That fits that bill. You've figured out the niche that where the gap is missing, and so this is, and you've taken that atomic IQ or atomic as your approach of sort of fulfilling that gap. I guess naturally the question I've got, you've identified this interesting niche, and here you are today. If you had a magic wand to fix one thing slowing you down in this business, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think the premise of am I being slowed down is the part that I'm noodling on, because I don't know that I'm being slowed down. I think I feel like I can't go fast enough sometimes, and I think that's something that a lot of people probably feel right now. I'll give you an example to illustrate it. I am what I would consider to be a very, like, I don't have a lot of hobbies. So when I don't work, I'm still doing stuff that most people would probably consider to be work. If I'm not at work, my brain is still working on things that are related to me being better at my work, whatever those things are. And I say all that because I think a lot of people that listen to podcasts or whatever would fit that ilk in their own way, shape, or form, so they can relate. And those who don't go, okay, well, I can do that better. I don't have a lot of hobbies, and I don't necessarily lament that. There's times where I go, man, I need to, like, invest some time, and I'll go hit some balls or do something fun, like, just to whatever. But I say all that because even as someone who kind of is always on in that way, unless I'm really off and just tuned out and just playing with the kids or something, um, I feel like I can't learn fast enough. And I've spent the last 25 years perfecting my ability to learn fast, right? I mean, I've been in multiple industries and I've had successes in multiple industries. I've also had failures in multiple industries, right? But I've usually, even when I've had a failure in an industry, I've also had a success in an industry. So I've like, I say all that because I'm someone who considers himself very adept at rapid iteration, rapid learning, and then, deploy and get to a formula or framework that can scale. And I feel right now, at times, like I can't keep up with everything I want to learn. It's the 15 unread books that I want to finish. It's the 48 unseen videos that I want to digest and do more than just AI summarize, and that I want to actually marinate on or think about it. Then it's like, and I go, holy crap, like, Am I being slowed down? No. More. Again, back through that context of more inevitable. You're not being slowed down. Then I look at that and I go, oh my gosh, like when I have conversations, I go like to the store and I walk around Costco and I look at everybody else and I go, is this what normal people, like, what do they worry about? What do they think about? And I don't know. And I'm not coming from a place of judgment. I'm just going, I'm worried about I didn't finish these 15 things and 5 new books and da da da. And I feel like, if I let myself, I can feel like I'm being slowed down. But the reality is that that's less than some people are doing in a day and more than others, right? I mean, I have no idea how Elon Musk makes it through a day, right? His version of more is way bigger than mine will ever, by both ambition and by talent. So when you put it in relative context, there's always a bigger fish, as they say in Star Wars, and there's always a bunch of smaller fish that are tuned out and don't even realize the things that they're missing. And somehow society still functions. So is it true that you're being slowed down, or is it just that I'm not focused on that thing called better? So again, I'll bring it back to that thing we started talking about, right? That framework, more is inevitable, less is a constraint and a reality, and better is in the middle. And so I think I would be better. That's my long ass answer for what would I do with the magic wand. I would focus on being better at whatever it is that I'm doing in that moment.
If we were to relate this to your current sort of venture at hand, Atomic IQ, what would that look like?
I would be better at putting the mechanisms in place to draw more awareness to the thought leadership that I do, because that would drive
Got you.
exponential deal flow to the portfolio companies. Yeah, if I could smash a magic wand and have it be better tomorrow, I'd have 1 million people reading me on Substack.
Yeah.
I'd have 100,000 people paying for the premium, and then the rest would exponentially scale from there. But it wouldn't be about the money. I mean, that's the obvious thing. It would be about the fact that now my starting point is 1 million eyeballs that are engaged, because my read rate's almost 50%. I'm like, okay, so every time I post something, 500,000 people are deeply engaged in it. Great. Now how do I get to 1 million? But my starting point would be at a scale where there's network effects. So that would be the magic wand. I go boom, and I'd have 1 million people on the Substack, and then everything else would take care of itself.
I appreciate you sharing that. Just a side reflection or a meta reflection. What I see that's a little different here is there is an element of consistency. Consistency in sticking to that framework, or consistency in practicing that framework and recognizing where things either fall in or are a little out of sync and bringing it back to that. And I think that practice there, I personally appreciate, because it sort of shows me that in practice, and I'm sure the people who are going to view this can sort of also appreciate that, hey, whatever pursuit you are in of life, be it your business, be it family, be it whatever relationship you're upholding, you've got a mantra that you've got to be able to be true to, and that's what that looks like in practice as you go through it. So I appreciate that as well.
Yeah, frameworks are good.
Yeah, I mean, as a management consultant, we live in frameworks, so I can definitely appreciate applying frameworks and sticking by it. And then where it breaks down, it's like, oh, okay, this is what it could have been, and you start to iterate on it and reflect on it.
You need a different framework.
Yeah, exactly. So today, Chris, I appreciate your time. We broke down a lot of different topics for today. I think the funnest of topics really is picking your brains in the inside and seeing what makes you, what drives you forward. But beyond that, I think, I really appreciate you taking the time to touch a little bit more on the struggles within the financial services around client acquisition and growth, the reliance on community, and how those are real strong sort of drivers and accelerators. Combine that with content. So once again, thank you so much for taking the time to share that, especially with the rich experience that you've got. That brings us to the end of this episode. This podcast is sponsored by Algo AI Partners. We help fintech service companies and business scale using smart AI solutions. If you're interested in a free consultation to find out more, please click the link below. Thank you.